The first sign of trouble wasn't a headline. It was a sudden disappearance. One moment Prince Andrew's name stood firmly on the internal royal calendar for an upcoming Windsor event, and the next, it had vanished without explanation. But what truly sent shockwaves through palace corridors was not Prince William's decision itself. It was the unexpected role Princess Charlotte reportedly played in exposing the private conversation that changed everything inside the House of Windsor. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, palace officials attempted to dismiss the change as nothing more than a scheduling adjustment, the kind of quiet reshuffling that happens constantly behind the scenes of royal administration. But insiders whisper that this time felt different. There was an unusual level of silence surrounding the decision. Staff members who would normally clarify protocol questions were suddenly refusing to answer calls. Senior aides reportedly received direct instructions not to discuss Andrew's removal under any circumstances. Even more striking, according to various interpretations circulating within royal circles, the updated calendar appeared to have been altered overnight after a tense strategy session involving William and a handful of his most trusted advisors at Kensington Palace. The speed of the change created immediate suspicion. Royal correspondents initially overlooked it, believing it to be another temporary effort to reduce controversy around Andrew's public profile. However, within hours, palace administrative streams ranging from security whispers to scheduling leaks began suggesting something far more permanent was unfolding behind closed doors. What made the atmosphere even more unsettling was the timing. Reports suggest the discussion happened shortly after a deeply private meeting between William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, one described by insiders as unusually emotional even by royal standards. Different interpretations of the evening described Catherine emerging visibly shaken, her calm public composure replaced by what one palace source allegedly called quiet dread. And then came the detail nobody expected. Princess Charlotte, who had reportedly wandered near one of the adjoining rooms during the discussion, allegedly overheard fragments of an exchange involving the words, "protecting the future," and "this cannot continue." Those words, innocent on the surface, suddenly took on explosive significance once Andrew's disappearance from the calendar became known. According to insiders familiar with the family dynamic, Charlotte later asked questions that caught both William and Catherine off guard. Questions about why certain family members were no longer appearing together. Questions about why palace staff seemed nervous whenever Andrew's name surfaced. And perhaps most painfully for William, questions that forced him to realize the younger generation of royals was beginning to notice the fractures the palace had spent years trying to conceal. That realization reportedly changed everything. Sources close to the royal household claim William had already been wrestling privately with fears about the monarchy's long-term survival in an era where scandal spreads faster than loyalty can contain it. The institution, already bruised by years of controversy, could no longer afford ambiguity. Palace insiders whisper that William had reached a chilling conclusion. Protecting the crown now required decisions that previous generations may have delayed or avoided altogether. Andrew's quiet removal from the calendar was not simply about avoiding headlines. It was allegedly part of a much larger strategy centered on safeguarding the monarchy for Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis before they inherited the full weight of royal life. Suddenly, what once appeared to be a routine protocol adjustment began to resemble something far more deliberate, a calculated separation designed to send a message both inside and outside palace walls. And as media speculation intensified, the silence from senior royals only deepened the mystery. No denials, no clarifications. Only an icy quiet that insiders say spoke louder than any public statement ever could. Because within the House of Windsor, silence has often been the clearest signal of all. But Andrew's removal from the calendar was only the surface of a far deeper royal reckoning, one tied to fears William could no longer ignore. Long before Princess Charlotte unknowingly became part of the story, Prince William had reportedly been wrestling with a question that haunted every future king before him. How much damage can one royal scandal inflict before the institution itself begins to crack? According to palace insiders, that question had lingered quietly in William's mind for years, growing heavier with every headline, every controversy, and every uncomfortable reminder that the monarchy's survival no longer depended solely on tradition, but on public trust. The House of Windsor had endured crises before: abdications, betrayals, public humiliation. But reports suggest the controversies surrounding Prince Andrew created a uniquely dangerous kind of pressure because they arrived during a period when faith in institutions across Britain was already beginning to weaken. And within palace walls, insiders whisper that William increasingly feared the damage was no longer temporary. It was becoming generational. Sources close to Kensington Palace claim William had grown intensely focused on protecting the future roles of Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis from what one advisor allegedly described as inherited fallout. The concern was not simply reputational, it was emotional. William reportedly understood better than most what it felt like to grow up inside an institution burdened by scandal and public scrutiny. But, according to various interpretations of private royal discussions, he became increasingly determined that his children would not spend their adult lives answering for controversies they had no part in creating. That fear reportedly intensified as palace advisors began quietly warning senior royals that public confidence in the monarchy was becoming fragile. Those familiar with internal polling and media analysis claim conversations behind closed doors had taken on a far darker tone than the public realized. Some courtiers allegedly compared the atmosphere to the years leading up to past constitutional crises, when silence and hesitation allowed public frustration to spiral into something far more dangerous. The comparison that reportedly unsettled William most was the growing number of whispers linking the modern monarchy's struggles to the abdication fears that once nearly shattered the crown generations earlier. At the center of this growing tension stood King Charles III, described by insiders as emotionally torn and increasingly exhausted. Reports suggest Charles remained deeply hesitant to escalate divisions within the family while managing his ongoing health struggles. Different interpretations of palace meetings describe a king desperate to preserve stability at a moment when both his health and the monarchy's public standing appeared vulnerable. But the more cautious Charles became, the more determined William reportedly grew. Palace insiders whisper that private conversations about streamlining the monarchy accelerated dramatically during this period, with senior advisors discussing what the institution should look like under a future William reign. The phrase "protecting the future" allegedly surfaced repeatedly during those meetings, not as a slogan, but as a warning. According to sources familiar with the discussions, William had begun to accept a painful reality. The survival of the monarchy might eventually require choices that would feel brutally personal. And yet, amid all the strategy sessions and institutional fears, the moment that reportedly shook William most did not come from a courtier, a constitutional expert, or even a political advisor. It came from Charlotte herself. Insiders claim she had started noticing unusual tension during family gatherings. Small things at first, conversations abruptly ending when certain names were mentioned. Uneasy silences during discussions about public appearances. Relatives appearing distant in ways children often notice long before adults realize it. According to palace whispers, Charlotte eventually asked an innocent question about why certain family members no longer seemed welcome in the same way they once had been. The simplicity of that question reportedly hit William harder than any newspaper headline ever could. Because in that moment, insiders suggest he realized the next generation was already beginning to see the fractures the palace had spent years trying to contain. And according to insiders, it was one seemingly harmless question from Charlotte that forced William to confront the reality he had been avoiding for years. Reports suggest the moment that changed everything did not happen during a Privy Council meeting or a legal briefing. It happened quietly inside a family conversation where Princess Charlotte allegedly asked why certain relatives no longer smiled around each other. According to insiders familiar with the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace, the question arrived during what was supposed to be an ordinary private evening between Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, and their children. There were no royal advisors present, no carefully rehearsed statements, No palace strategy documents waiting on polished desks. Just a family attempting to navigate tensions that had become impossible to completely hide from the younger generation. And yet, sources claim the simplicity of Charlotte's observations struck with devastating force because it exposed something William had spent years trying to prevent. The slow realization among his children that the royal family's fractures were no longer private. According to various palace interpretations, Charlotte had quietly begun noticing changes during gatherings at Windsor and Sandringham long before adults realized she was paying attention. She reportedly observed that certain conversations suddenly stopped when specific names were mentioned. She noticed how some relatives appeared tense around one another, while others avoided eye contact altogether during public family appearances. Most painfully of all, insiders whisper that Charlotte had started recognizing the unexplained absence of Prince Andrew from discussions where he once would have been included naturally. At first, William and Catherine allegedly believed the children remained shielded from the deeper tensions surrounding the monarchy. But according to sources close to the household, Charlotte's questions revealed the atmosphere inside the family had already begun speaking louder than the official silence surrounding it. Reports suggest Charlotte innocently mentioned hearing palace staff whisper words like embarrassment and reputation while passing through corridors at Windsor. She reportedly did not fully understand what those words meant in the context of royal life. But for William, insiders claim the moment felt chilling because it confirmed that even the carefully controlled world surrounding his children could no longer fully contain the anxiety spreading through the institution itself. Those familiar with the emotional dynamic between William and Catherine suggest the exchange left both parents deeply unsettled, though in very different ways. Catherine reportedly urged caution, believing the children should remain protected from the growing hostility surrounding royal controversies for as long as possible. Sources close to palace staff describe her as increasingly concerned about preserving emotional stability within the family while the monarchy itself endured a period of mounting pressure. But William, according to insiders, reacted differently. Rather than seeing Charlotte's question as an isolated family moment, he allegedly viewed it as proof that the crisis surrounding Andrew had crossed an invisible line. The younger generation was beginning to notice, and once children begin asking questions, the illusion of containment begins to collapse. Palace whispers claim William spent hours reflecting on the exchange afterward, reportedly revisiting fears he had carried privately for years about what unresolved scandals could eventually do to the crown's credibility. Because unlike previous generations, his children were growing up in an era where silence no longer erased suspicion. Reports suggest William later had a deeply emotional private conversation with Charlotte herself, one that insiders describe as both heartbreaking and transformative. Different interpolations. Reactions of the discussion vary, but several palace sources claim William attempted to explain the importance of duty, responsibility, and public trust without exposing his daughter to the full darkness of the tensions consuming the royal household. Yet even within that effort, insiders whisper there was an unmistakable sadness in William's realization that his children were beginning to inherit not only royal privilege, but the emotional burden that comes with protecting an institution under relentless scrutiny. And from that moment forward, according to palace insiders, William's approach reportedly hardened. What once may have been viewed as temporary distancing around Andrew increasingly became part of a broader determination to preserve the monarchy's future at almost any emotional cost. Because the scandal was no longer something confined to headlines, press briefings, or palace strategy meetings. It had entered the family itself. But what Charlotte unknowingly exposed was not eerily discomfort inside the family. It was a growing divide between Charles and William over the monarchy's future itself. By the time Prince Andrew's name disappeared from the royal calendar, palace insiders claim Prince William had already begun executing what some staff privately described as a quiet future-proofing operation designed to shield the next generation of royals from inherited controversy. According to reports circulating through royal administrative circles, the decision did not emerge suddenly from one emotional conversation or one difficult headline. It was the result of months of growing tension, private strategy meetings, and increasingly urgent discussions about what the monarchy could survive in the modern era. Insiders whisper that William had reached a deeply uncomfortable conclusion long before the public realized anything was changing. The institution could no longer afford uncertainty around who represented the crown and who did not. Behind palace walls, where re-tradition usually moves with agonizing slowness, reports suggest William began pushing for something far more controlled, deliberate, and strategic than anything seen in previous generations. Sources close to Kensington Palace claim William started advocating for stricter oversight regarding royal appearances, ceremonial placements, and even informal associations connected to public events. What once operated through quiet assumptions and family understandings allegedly became subject to direct review by senior aides loyal to the future king. Guest lists were reportedly examined line by line. Seating arrangements at official gatherings became matters of unusual sensitivity. Palace administrative teams allegedly received instructions to evaluate not only public optics, but long-term reputational impact tied to every royal appearance. According to various interpretations of these internal efforts, an entirely new mindset was beginning to take shape inside William's circle once centered on what insiders privately called modern monarchy optics. The phrase may have sounded clinical, even cold, but those familiar with the discussions claim its meaning was deeply personal. William reportedly believed the monarchy could no longer survive through silence alone. Every public image, every family interaction, every ceremonial appearance now carried consequences far beyond palace walls. And unlike older generations who relied on deference from the public, William understood he was preparing his children for a future where scrutiny would be constant, immediate, and unforgiving. Yet while William's determination reportedly hardened, insiders suggest Prince Andrew himself believed his reduced role would eventually recover with time. Sources whisper that Andrew viewed many of the restrictions surrounding his appearances as temporary measures designed to calm public outrage rather than permanent institutional exile. According to palace interpretations, this belief created a growing disconnect between Andrew and the shifting reality unfolding around him. Because while he reportedly expected gradual reintegration, William had allegedly begun building an entirely different vision for the monarchy's future, one where controversial figures could no longer quietly drift back into prominence once media attention faded. That vision, however, did not emerge without resistance. Reports suggest several old guard royal figures privately opposed the aggressive nature of William's strategy, believing the institution risked appearing disloyal to members of its own family. Some insiders allegedly argued that the monarchy had historically survived by enduring scandal quietly rather than publicly distancing itself from relatives during moments of weakness. Others feared William's increasingly firm approach signaled a generational shift that could permanently alter how the crown handled internal crises moving forward. But according to sources close to the family, the moment involved Princess Charlotte changed the emotional weight of the entire situation for William. Her accidental involvement reportedly became symbolic of something much larger than a private family misunderstanding. It represented the exact future William feared most, a future where the next generation of royals inherited not only titles and privilege, but also unresolved scandal, institutional distrust, and emotional fractures hidden beneath public ceremony. Palace insiders whisper that after Charlotte's innocent questions exposed just how visible the tension had become inside the family itself, William stopped viewing the issue as something that could be delayed indefinitely. What once felt politically difficult suddenly became emotionally urgent. The monarchy's future, in his eyes, was no longer an abstract constitutional concern. It was sitting at his own dinner table, listening carefully, beginning to notice everything adults hoped children would not understand. And from that point forward, according to various reports, William's resolve reportedly became almost impossible to reverse. But removing Andrew's name from one calendar was only the beginning, because the real battle erupted when word of William's decision reached the wider royal household. The reaction inside royal circles was reportedly immediate and icy. Some viewed Prince William's move as necessary leadership. Others saw it as a brutal public distancing that threatened to deepen fractures already tearing through the House of Windsor. According to insiders, The atmosphere inside palace corridors shifted almost overnight after Prince Andrew's removal from the royal calendar became known among senior households. What had once been whispered cautiously behind closed doors reportedly erupted into tense private exchanges filled with frustration, fear, and quiet resentment. Different interpretations of the fallout describe royal aides scrambling to contain growing unease as courtiers aligned themselves behind opponent, oozing visions of the monarchy's future. Some believed William was finally confronting a crisis the institution had delayed for too long. Others allegedly feared his increasingly uncompromising approach risked creating an internal rupture the family might never fully repair. And standing directly in the middle of that growing storm was King Charles III, emotionally exhausted and reportedly struggling to balance two forces pulling him in opposite directions: fatherly loyalty on one side, institutional survival on the other. Sources close to the palace suggest Charles understood why William felt compelled to act. Reports claim the king had privately acknowledged for years that the monarchy remained haunted by controversies connected to Andrew, even as public attention shifted elsewhere. But according to insiders, Charles also feared the emotional consequences of allowing the family itself to fracture under the pressure of public scrutiny. Palace whispers describe increasingly difficult conversations between senior royal households, where discussions about duty and optics became painfully entangled with loyalty, history, and blood ties. Some senior courtiers reportedly argued that permanently sidelining Andrew would signal strength and accountability in a rapidly changing world. Others allegedly warned that such a visible distancing could create the appearance of institutional panic, fueling even greater speculation about divisions within the monarchy. According to various interpretations of private meetings, tensions escalated sharply as William refused to soften his position despite mounting pressure from figures who believed the family should prioritize unity above all else. The more resistance emerged, insiders claim, the more determined William appeared to become. At the center of the emotional fallout stood Andrew himself, reportedly blindsided by the speed and seriousness of the calendar decision. Sources familiar with palace dynamics suggest he initially believed the situation would eventually calm, allowing him to quietly regain some level of public visibility over time. Instead, the removal of his name from official planning reportedly felt to him like something far more permanent, a symbolic line being drawn inside the institution he had spent his entire life within. Insiders whisper that the realization created waves of bitterness and disbelief among those still loyal to him inside royal circles. Some allegedly viewed William's actions as cold and strategically ruthless, particularly during a period when the wider family was already navigating health struggles and growing public pressure. Yet, despite the emotional weight of the backlash, reports suggest William remained unmoved. Palace aides allegedly attempted to explore softer alternatives, quieter compromises, or temporary arrangements that could ease tensions without fully reversing course. But according to insiders, William repeatedly returned to the same argument. The monarchy could not be. Asked the public to forget what it refused to clearly confront itself. Throughout the escalating turmoil, Catherine, Princess of Wales, reportedly played a far quieter but equally significant role behind the scenes. Sources close to Kensington Palace claim Catherine worked carefully to preserve emotional stability within the family while still supporting William's broader determination to protect the institution's future. Insiders describe her as deeply aware of the emotional cost these decisions carried, particularly for their children, who were increasingly beginning to sense the tension surrounding them. And perhaps that was what haunted William most of all, because according to palace whispers, Princess Charlotte had unknowingly become symbolic of something much larger than one difficult family situation. She represented the next generation watching everything unfold in real time. A generation that would one day inherit not just the ceremonies and traditions of monarchy, but also the consequences of how this crisis was handled. That realization reportedly hardened William's resolve even further, because to him, insiders claim, this was no longer simply about Andrew. It was about what kind of monarchy his children would eventually stand inside. And as tensions escalated behind palace walls, insiders began whispering that William's decision carried a message far bigger than Andrew alone. According to various palace interpretations, Prince William's deepest fear was never simply another scandal. It was the possibility that the monarchy itself could slowly lose the trust of the very generation Princess Charlotte belongs to. Reports suggest that behind every tense discussion, every carefully adjusted royal appearance, and every increasingly difficult decision surrounding Prince Andrew, William had become consumed by a far larger question about the future of the crown itself. Palace insiders whisper that he no longer viewed public accountability as a public relations strategy. To him, it had become a matter of institutional survival. The monarchy had weathered scandals before because previous generations still viewed the crown with instinctive loyalty, even during moments of public anger. But according to sources close to Kensington Palace, William increasingly believed the world his children were inheriting operated by entirely different rules. Silence no longer protected institutions. Distance no longer erased suspicion. And tradition alone no longer guaranteed trust. Insiders claim William had become particularly concerned about how younger generations now viewed privilege, secrecy, and perceived double standards inside powerful institutions. According to Palace Whispers, advisors repeatedly warned that public patience was becoming thinner, with every unresolved controversy attached to the royal family. What frightened William most, reports suggest, was not outrage itself, but indifference. The possibility that younger audiences could eventually stop believing the monarchy represented sacrifice, responsibility, and moral leadership altogether. Those familiar with his thinking claim this fear shaped nearly every decision he made behind the scenes. Because when William looked at Prince George, Charlotte, and Prince Louis, he reportedly did not just see his children. He saw the future survival of an institution that had already endured generations of scandal, heartbreak, and reinvention. Palace insiders whisper that this is why he reportedly reacted so strongly to Charlotte's innocent observations about growing tension inside the family. To William, the moment symbolized something deeply unsettling. If even children inside the palace could sense the contradictions surrounding royal accountability, then the outside world had certainly noticed them too. According to various royal interpretations, William increasingly found himself reflecting on the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II during this period of growing internal conflict. Source: as close to palace discussions claim he often returned privately to her emphasis on restraint, discipline, and sacrifice over personal comfort. Insiders whisper that William believed the late Queen understood something fundamental about monarchy that modern public figures often fail to grasp, that the institution survives only when the public believes those within it are willing to place duty above themselves. And in William's eyes, reports suggest that principle could not remain selective or symbolic. It had to apply even when emotionally painful, even when family loyalty complicated everything. Palace aides allegedly noticed his language becoming firmer in internal discussions, with increasing references to long-term credibility and future legitimacy. The crown, according to insiders familiar with these conversations, could no longer afford moral ambiguity if it hoped to survive the next generation of public scrutiny. That belief reportedly transformed the royal calendar itself to something far larger than a scheduling document. According to Palace Whispers, it became a symbolic battlefield over legitimacy, accountability, and the future direction of the monarchy. Every inclusion carried meaning. Every absence carried consequences. And while some courtiers feared William's increasingly uncompromising approach risked deepening divisions inside the family, insiders claim he had already accepted that difficult choices were unavoidable. Reports suggest he became determined to draw hard lines where previous generations may have relied on delay, hoping clarity would ultimately preserve what hesitation could not. Because in William's mind, according to various palace interpretations, protecting the monarchy for George, Charlotte, and Louis meant confronting uncomfortable realities before those realities consumed the institution entirely. The emotional cost of that realization reportedly weighed heavily on him, but insiders whisper that by then, he no longer believed there was a safe path backward. But even after the calendar controversy erupted, one final moment reportedly convinced palace insiders that William had no intention of turning back. Then came the move that transformed private whispers into undeniable reality. during preparations for a major royal engagement. Insiders noticed Prince Andrew's absence was no longer being quietly hidden, it was being institutionally normalized. According to palace sources, this was the moment many within royal circles realized the situation had crossed an invisible threshold. What had once appeared to be temporary distancing suddenly began resembling a permanent restructuring of the monarchy's internal future. Reports suggest royal event planners were instructed to move forward with major ceremonial preparations without contingency arrangements involving Andrew at all. For years, insiders claim, there had always remained some quiet flexibility within palace planning, some possibility that appearances could eventually be restored depending on public mood and institutional pressure. But this time felt chillingly different. According to various interpretations circulating among staff, Andrew's absence was no longer being treated as an awkward pause in royal life. It was being absorbed into the system itself as though the monarchy was slowly preparing for a future in which his return no longer factored into long-term calculations. Sources close to palace administration claim Andrew's name quietly began disappearing from internal projections tied to future engagements, ceremonial planning, and broader institutional strategy. Insiders whisper that these changes happened gradually enough to avoid immediate public attention, yet deliberately enough that senior staff could not ignore their significance. The shift reportedly coincided with Prince William consolidating greater influence around a trusted circle of senior royals and advisors, who shared his growing belief that the monarchy needed firm boundaries in order to survive. According to palace whispers, William had become increasingly strategic about who remained visible within the institution's core image moving forward. And as those adjustments accelerated, reports suggest support quietly emerged from some of the monarchy's most respected figures. Sources familiar with royal dynamics claim Anne, Princess Royal, privately supported broader efforts aimed at protecting the institution's long-term credibility, particularly regarding public accountability and duty. Meanwhile, insiders also point toward Prince Edward as another stabilizing figure behind the scenes, someone reportedly aligned with the belief that preserving public trust required difficult sacrifices, even when emotionally painful for the family itself. According to media insiders and palace observers, signs of a coordinated shift in royal optics soon became impossible to fully ignore. Royal correspondents allegedly began noticing patterns in official planning that suggested something larger was unfolding behind the scenes. Invitations, appearances, balcony positioning, and ceremonial roles increasingly reflected a more concentrated vision of the monarchy centered around continuity, discipline, and carefully controlled representation. Reports suggest palace households became more synchronized in their messaging, with fewer inconsistencies surrounding who represented the institution publicly and who did not. And quietly, almost symbolically, the earlier moment involving Princess Charlotte continued echoing through internal discussions. According to insiders, what once seemed like an innocent child's observation gradually transformed into something far more unsettling within palace circles. Staff reportedly began viewing Charlotte's question not merely as a family moment, but as evidence that the next generation was already sensitive to contradictions surrounding accountability, loyalty, and royal duty. That realization carried enormous emotional weight because it reinforced William's deepest fear that the monarchy could not preserve trust externally if tension and uncertainty had already become visible internally to the very children meant to inherit it one day. As these changes unfolded, insiders whisper that a larger realization slowly began spreading through royal circles. William's monarchy may look profoundly different from King Charles III's reign. Reports suggest some courtiers viewed this shift with admiration, believing William was preparing the institution for a harsher and more skeptical modern world. Others allegedly viewed it with quiet anxiety, fearing the emotional consequences of such a controlled and uncompromising approach to family crises. Yet despite the tension, the momentum behind William's vision reportedly continued strengthening. Because by this point, according to palace interpretations, the future king no longer believed delay was protecting the institution. He believed delay was weakening it. Once that mindset took hold, insiders claimed there was little chance the monarchy would simply return to the old patterns that once governed royal life. And in the silence that followed Andrew's disappearance from royal planning, a new royal era quietly began taking shape behind closed palace gates. In the end, palace insiders suggest Princess Charlotte never intended to expose anything at all. Yet through one innocent observation, she reportedly forced the future king to confront a painful truth. The next generation was already watching, already listening, and already judging the choices made behind royal walls. According to various interpretations circulating within royal circles, that realization changed something fundamental inside Prince William. For years, the monarchy had survived through carefully controlled silence, measured appearances, and an unspoken belief that time itself could soften almost any controversy. But reports suggest William no longer believed that strategy C would protect the institution his children were destined to inherit. The world surrounding the crown had changed too dramatically. Public trust had become fragile. Scrutiny had become relentless. And younger generations, raised in an age of constant exposure and immediate judgment, no longer separated personal behavior from institutional legitimacy. According to palace insiders, William increasingly understood that tradition alone would not preserve the monarchy's future. Credibility would matter just as much, perhaps even more. Sources close to Kensington Palace claim Charlotte's innocent questions quietly became symbolic of a much larger shift happening inside the royal household. She represented a generation growing up surrounded not only by ceremony and privilege, but by awareness. Awareness of tension. Awareness of contradiction. Awareness that even within palaces, silence often hides discomfort too deep to explain openly. Insiders whisper that what unsettled William most was not Charlotte's words themselves, but the realization that children could already sense the emotional fractures adults were desperately trying to contain. Because if the younger royals were beginning to notice those tensions privately, then the wider public had undoubtedly noticed them long ago. Reports suggest this realization hardened William's determination to redefine what royal accountability would look like under his future reign. And gradually, according to palace interpretations, Prince Andrew's removal stopped being viewed internally as an act of punishment alone. It became something colder, more strategic. A form of preservation designed to protect the institution from carrying unresolved scandal indefinitely into the next generation. At the center of that transformation stood King Charles III, reportedly watching the monarchy enter a far harsher era than the one he inherited. According to insiders familiar with palace tensions, Charles struggled deeply with the emotional cost of what was unfolding around him. He belonged to a generation shaped by loyalty to family above almost everything else. But reports suggest even he had begun privately accepting that the crown now existed inside a world where public confidence could disappear far faster than royal tradition could restore it. Different interpretations of internal discussions describe Charles as increasingly aware that William's approach, though emotionally difficult, reflected the demands of a changing monarchy rather than simple personal ambition. Palace whispers claim the king gradually recognized that the future institution his son envisioned would likely be smaller, stricter, and far less tolerant of prolonged controversy than previous royal eras had been. And while some courtiers reportedly viewed that shift with concern, others believed it represented the only realistic path forward in a modern world no longer willing to excuse silence from powerful institutions. Yet, according to insiders, the now burden of those choices remained enormous. Because beneath the discussions about optics, accountability, and institutional survival stood a painful human reality the palace could never fully escape. Every strategic decision carried emotional consequences for the family itself. Every act of distancing created another fracture behind closed doors. Reports suggest William understood this better than anyone, which is why his decisions reportedly became heavier, quieter, and more emotionally guarded as tensions escalated. But palace insiders whisper that by then, he believed protecting George, Charlotte, and Louis from inheriting a weakened institution required sacrifices previous generations may never have imagined making so publicly. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the House of Windsor appeared to enter what some insiders now describe as a new age of royal accountability, where symbolism mattered as much as ceremony, and credibility mattered as much as bloodline. Because within the House of Windsor, the most dangerous revelations are rarely shouted in public, they are whispered quietly enough for the next generation to hear. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.